In today's discussion, we'll focus on the psychological factors that impact entrepreneurial strategic decisions. Within our objectives, we will look first at the factors that influence decision-making and motivation, and we'll also spend some time talking about cognitive biases and heuristics that are common in entrepreneurship. To start the discussion, there's a question, well, what do we mean by strategic? And by that we mean things that are not simple, that are dynamic, that are complex, that involve some necessary plans of action, and also involve some level of uncertainty and are difficult to predict. And this requires significant resources and thought and analysis, and that the results of these decisions can be significant. So we're not necessarily talking about where you may go to dinner or what color clothing you may buy. These are things that are substantial and that there are significant gains and loss of time, money, reputation, etc., that are consequences of the decision for the better or for the worse. There are many traits that influence decision-making among entrepreneurs. One is certainly your personal attributes and characteristics, and we'll discuss those. One is the attitude towards the venture or towards the decision. There's a risk propensity that we'll discuss as well. There's an element of motivation. There are certainly emotions that are in play. And there's this cognitive element that we've discussed before regarding how you perceive and think about decisions. So as an illustration of what we mean by uncertainty and how you may perceive risk, we'll take a look at a simple example of given the choice of playing one of two games. The first game would be flipping a coin. So you would call heads or tails, I would flip the coin. You have a 50% chance of winning, and you may win $10. If you do this multiple times, long term you would have an expected return of $5 and that you should be right half the time. The second game may have a 1% chance of winning $250. So with that, if we had 100 numbers in a hat, if you guessed the number, I pulled out that number, and if they matched 1 to 100, then you would win $250. So you have a 1% chance of winning $250, and over time your expected average return is $2.50. Now if we do that math, we see that the safe bet is 50% of winning $10. And that we can see when you multiply the probability of that occurring, if you were purely rational and purely logical in your decision making, you would always choose the flip a coin option. But many of us may be tempted to go for the $250, that the difference of what we could do with $10 versus $250 is significant, and many people may have the preference of taking that 1% chance of winning $250, recognizing that the odds are against them. That's what we mean by entrepreneurial decision making, and that it's not rational per se, and that there is a level of risk involved, but that a number of us would take that risk, and that we would shoot for the higher goal, understanding that the probability of achieving that is less. And so within that, entrepreneurs are not necessarily risk-seeking, nor are they necessarily any riskier than other individuals, but they may just simply accept risk or perceive risk differently. And in that way, they may see things differently than others. And it's that risk propensity that certainly plays a role in that. If you are an individual, for example, that may have been laid off from a job multiple times, such as a friend of mine, her decision to start a company was perceived as being safer than going to work for a company to which she may be laid off again, which had happened multiple times before. So in that way, she saw the opportunity of starting a venture as being safer in her perception than going to work for someone else. And again, that perception is hers and hers alone and isn't necessarily right or wrong for others. It's based on how you perceive risk given certain scenarios and certain individual tendencies. And so within that, when you go back and you take a look at this game, it's not necessarily a question of should you be risky or should you not be risky. It's more of a question of what do you perceive as the incentive, what do you perceive as the risk, and then what decision would you make between the 50% game or the 1% game. And a simple example of that, again, would be if you were given the opportunity to play me in a round of golf, and the winner would receive an A. The loser would receive an F. So in that way, there are significant stakes of receiving a high grade or receiving a low grade. And there are a couple of considerations that you should ask. One is, do you play golf? If you do play golf, and if you're good, and if you believe that you can beat me, it might be a low-risk proposition to engage in such a game. If, however, you do not play golf, and or you do not believe that you could beat me, then you probably should not enter that game. So again, risk is more about the scenario, your background, your experience, your tendency, than it is simply a question of, are you risky or are you unrisky? It's more complex than that. So as an example of risk and risk perception and acceptance, we can take a look at Facebook. This was a firm started by a college student in the US in 2004 that was based initially on an idea that he had had in high school. He launched this social networking platform at Harvard. Within 2 weeks, had half of the student body signed up. Quickly grew that to 30 other colleges in the region, moved to Silicon Valley, partnered with Sean Parker of Napster, and really began to grow and scale the firm. They were able to go out and successfully raise some venture capital in the context of initially angel investment and then later larger traditional VC funding at a valuation of $100 million shortly after the firm was launched, so very rapid growth. They continued to grow the firm and expanded into serving high school students and expanded their feature set as well of photo sharing. They then raised significant rounds of funding thereafter and had a much greater valuation. Shortly before this, the firm was viewed as being worth $100 million based on future profit potential, and now they're at over $500 million. And they were supporting anyone with an email account. And so they had grown from the college niche to high school to now anyone that wanted to be a member. They then were offered $750 million to be acquired, to be bought, to be owned by Viacom, and Mark Zuckerberg and the Facebook team declined. Earlier that summer, they had a $1 billion Shortly thereafter, Viacom attempted to acquire the company for $750 million. Zuckerberg and the Facebook team declined. A few months later, a $1 billion offer declined. The following year, Microsoft, $240 million investment for 1.6% of the company, making Facebook worth $15 billion based on that investment. 500 million members signed, and $1 billion in revenue achieved. And all of that happened in a span of approximately 6 years. So in that way, what we see is rapid growth, and to grow the company at such a high scale, there were multiple opportunities to be bought and to be acquired that were turned down, and the expectation of the Facebook team is that there was greater upside ahead. So with that, when we look at risk, it's easy to be risky when the stakes are low, but when you are working in high-stakes situation, we want to think about, well, again, what are we risking? Is it financial? Is it safety? Is it ethics? So all of these certainly play a role. Within entrepreneurs, there's not an element of, again, seeking risk, but it's more about perception and capability and what they see as a relative return. So when we look at entrepreneurial motivation, this is certainly central to understanding how entrepreneurs make decisions and how they perceive risk. And there are 3 factors involved with that: self-efficacy, cognitive motivation, and tolerance for ambiguity. By self-efficacy, what we mean is that this is your belief that you can do something and something specific. So it's not self-confidence, which is a bit more of a broader perception, but it's efficacy in that you believe for a given scenario in a given situation that you can have success with that you will be effective in that situation or that specific task or activity. And that's a key predictor of individual performance. The second element that we'll look at is the cognitive motivation. And again, that's that element of thinking. Do you like to research? Do you like to understand? Do you like to get a good, clean sense of what's involved and what's at stake and what you can do in that scenario? And we see that if you do not have that high level of cognitive motivation, you tend to perhaps over-rely on assumptions or experience. And we see that successful entrepreneurs often have a higher need for cognitive motivation, and that they're willing to do the research and they're willing to try and understand why things happen or may happen as they will. And the third element is the tolerance for ambiguity, and that fundamentally is just being comfortable with change. It's recognizing that you can't predict everything, that things are going to happen that are unexpected, and that you're comfortable within that, and you believe that you can be successful within that changing environment. There are 3 cognitive biases to think about and to be aware of, and some of these are positives and some of these can be negatives. And the first is overconfidence. We certainly want to be confident. We certainly want to believe in our venture, but it's perhaps too much of a good thing if you are overconfident. So in that way, we want to be careful not to be overly ambitious. And we've talked before about throwing good money after bad. It is okay to close a venture. It is okay to start something and stop it. And in that way, again, there's something to be learned from that. But you certainly want to be sure that you balance your ideas, that your thoughts are supported by research, and that your assumptions are validated. Representativeness. What we mean here is that you want to be sure that you are not basing your decisions on too small of a sample set, that you don't ask someone if they like your idea, they say yes, and you start your venture. Ask many people. Ask what they like. Ask what they don't like, how they would improve, what they would pay. So don't take too small of a sample set. Don't take too small of a survey. And with that, there's a danger of, again, overgeneralizing if you are down the path of accepting what a small group of people say. Make sure you get a good random sample and that you understand the reality of the situation. Counterfactual thinking is something to be aware of as well, and this is an element of thinking about what might have been. And the element here is that we want to be careful that the sense of regret or disappointment doesn't drive us to take and act on every opportunity that we consider. This can result in us spending time and money on mediocre opportunities with minimal chance of success for fear that we're going to miss out on something. So in that case, again, beware of this counterfactual thinking. Realize that you're likely to have many great ideas over your career, and be careful in choosing which ones to act on and which ones not to act on. And that's a central theme of what we're going to be talking about later in the course. So in summary, this has given you some perspective on some of the complex psychological factors, including risk and motivation, that entrepreneurs struggle with, and also hopefully enlightens you to several biases and heuristics that play a role in identifying and analyzing entrepreneurial opportunities.